At the pinnacle of his success, on the night he was meant to gracefully exit the empire, he built. Millionaire Edward Langford didn't receive a gold watch. Instead, he gave a gift. In front of a ballroom filled with the city's elite, he looked his smiling wife Victoria in the eyes and served her divorce papers. This wasn't a sudden act of passion. It was the final devastating move in a game only he knew he was playing. What followed was not just a divorce, but the complete and public annihilation of a meticulously constructed lie, leaving everyone who betrayed him to bitterly regret underestimating the quiet, observant man they thought they had fooled. The Langford residence in Atherton, California, wasn't a house. It was a statement. A sprawling Mediterranean-style villa nestled behind ancient oaks and impenetrable iron gates, it broadcasted wealth with an elegant, almost dismissive confidence. Every stone of its facade, every curated piece of art in its echoing foyer spoke of the fortune Edward Langford had built from nothing. He was the founder of Langford Innovations, a tech behemoth born from a single brilliant algorithm he'd coded in his garage 30 years ago. Now, at 65, he was a legend in Silicon Valley, the quiet genius, the methodical titan who outplayed competitors with unnerving patience. His wife, Victoria, was the villa's living centerpiece. 15 years his junior, she was a vision of cultivated beauty. Her days were a tapestry of charity luncheons, gallery openings, and fittings with personal shoppers on Rodeo Drive. She moved through life with the serene grace of a woman who had never had to check a price tag. To the outside world, they were the perfect couple, Edward, the powerhouse provider, and Victoria, the elegant socialite who softened his corporate edges. But inside the gilded cage, the gold was beginning to flake. For the past year, a subtle discord had crept into their lives. Edward, winding down his duties in anticipation of his retirement, was home more often. He was quieter, more observant than ever, and his presence, which once felt like a comfortable anchor, now felt like a spotlight. Victoria felt it most keenly. She had grown accustomed to his long hours, his business trips, his mind being 1,000 miles away, wrestling with market projections and code. His new attentiveness was unnerving. He'd look at her across the dinner table, his grey eyes usually warm and crinkling at the corners, now holding a flat, unreadable expression. "You seem distant, darling," she'd say, placing her manicured hand over his. He would force a smile. "Just tired, Leah." A lot to wrap up before the big party. The big party was his retirement gala. It was all anyone in their social circle could talk about. Victoria had thrown herself into the planning with a fervor that bordered on manic. It was to be the event of the season held in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont San Francisco. 400 guests, a Michelin-starred chef, and a private performance by a Grammy-winning artist. It was her masterpiece, a final testament to the Langford dynasty she had so flawlessly managed in the public eye. Her obsession with the party served another purpose. It was a convenient excuse. An excuse for the endless phone calls, the secretive texts that she'd quickly angle away from Edward's view, the frequent planning meetings that took her away from home for hours on end. Her co-planner in this grand deception was Adrian Locke. Adrian was Edward's protégé. Handpicked from Stanford a decade ago, he was sharp, ambitious, and devastatingly charismatic. Edward had seen a younger version of himself in Adrian's hunger and had mentored him, fast-tracking him to senior vice president of strategy. He treated him like a son, which made Adrian's betrayal all the more venomous. The affair had started innocently enough. Adrian, always present at company functions, would be the one to keep Victoria company, while Edward was holding court with investors. He'd fetch her a drink, compliment her dress, and listen to her complaints about feeling like a corporate accessory. He made her feel seen. The flattery soon bled into flirtation, then into clandestine meetings at boutique hotels in Sausalito, disguised as sourcing trips for the party. "He has no idea," Victoria whispered to Adrian. One afternoon, her head resting on his chest, in a sun-drenched hotel room overlooking the bay. The scent of his cologne, a sharp, modern scent, so different from Edward's classic bay rum, was intoxicating. "He sees you as a fixture, darling." "A beautiful, perfect part of the furniture," Adrian murmured, his fingers tracing the strap of her lingerie. "He doesn't see the woman. I do." This was their shared narrative. Edward was the past, a brilliant but fading legacy. They were the future. Adrian, with his insider knowledge of Langford innovations, and Victoria, with her presumed claim to half the Langford fortune, were planning a hostile takeover of a different kind. Once Edward was retired and the divorce was settled, they imagined a life of even greater splendor, funded by Edward's life's work. They were a team, a partnership built on a shared contempt for the man who had given them everything. "We just need to get through this party," Adrian said, his voice hardening slightly. "Let him have his moment. Let him ride off into the sunset. Then we make our move. 6 months from now, we'll be drinking champagne on a yacht in Monaco, and he'll be a distant memory." Victoria smiled, a genuine predatory smile that rarely graced her features at home. To Monaco she toasted, clinking her imaginary glass against his. Their arrogance was their undoing. They mistook Edward's silence for ignorance. They saw his weariness as weakness. They operated under the blissful assumption that the quiet genius who could predict global market shifts with uncanny accuracy was somehow blind to the seismic betrayal occurring under his own roof. One evening, a week before the party, Edward was in his study, a cavernous room lined with books on philosophy, history, and quantum physics. He wasn't reading. He was looking at a photograph on his desk, a much younger Edward and Victoria on their honeymoon in Lake Como, their faces bright with what he had, until recently, believed was genuine love. His daughter Chloe, a 28-year-old art curator, with her father's sharp intellect and a fierce loyalty that was about to be tested, knocked softly and entered. "Hey, Dad, you okay? You've been locked in here for hours." Edward looked up, the mask of pleasant neutrality slipping back into place. "Just reminiscing, sweetheart. It's been a long road. Mom is in overdrive with this party. She's stressing about the floral arrangements giving off the wrong emotional frequency," Chloe said, rolling her eyes. "And Adrian is practically glued to her side. You'd think he was the co-host." Edward's gaze flickered for a fraction of a second. "Adrian has been a great help to your mother. Very attentive." Chloe frowned, catching the strange inflection in his voice. "Is everything all right? Between you and Mom?" Edward stood and walked to the large bay window overlooking the perfectly manicured gardens, now shrouded in twilight. He watched as the automatic sprinklers hissed to life, watering lawns that would be green and perfect tomorrow, no matter the circumstances. "Your mother and I are entering a new chapter," he said, his voice low and heavy. "And this party will be the beginning of it. A much-needed new beginning." Chloe studied her father's back. He seemed older than his 65 years, carrying a weight that had nothing to do with his company. She felt a pang of unease, a sense that the foundations of their perfect family were not as solid as the stone of their perfect house. "Well, I hope it's a good one," she said softly. Edward turned from the window, a strange, sad smile on his lips. "Oh, it will be Chloe," he said. "It will be memorable for everyone." He knew everything, the texts, the hotels, the whispered plans for his money. The party wasn't just a celebration of his retirement. It was a stage, a meticulously crafted, perfectly lit stage upon which he would not be the guest of honor, but the director of a tragedy. And the final act was about to begin. The illusion of Edward Langford's ignorance was a masterpiece of self-control. It was not a recent development. The first crack in his perfect porcelain world had appeared 14 months earlier, on a Tuesday that was otherwise unremarkable. He had come home early, a board meeting finishing ahead of schedule. As he walked down the marble hallway, he heard Victoria's voice drifting from the sunroom. It was light and bubbly, a girlish tone he hadn't heard in years. He paused, not wanting to interrupt what sounded like a happy call with one of her friends. But then he heard the name. "Oh, Adrian, you're terrible." It was followed by a low, throaty laugh that made the hairs on Edward's arms stand up. It wasn't the name itself that was damning. Adrian was a constant presence in their lives. It was the tone, the intimate, conspiratorial glee. Edward stood motionless, his briefcase handle digging into his palm. He heard her whisper, "I have to go. I think he's home," before the call ended abruptly. When he entered the sunroom, she was flushed, her phone clutched in her hand. "Darling, you're home early," she exclaimed, her surprise a little too sharp. Meeting ended. "Who were you talking to?" He asked, his tone carefully neutral. "Just Caroline going over details for the hospital fundraiser." She lied, the words flowing effortlessly. It was the ease of the lie that struck him first. It was practiced. That night, he lay awake long after Victoria's breathing had deepened into a steady rhythm. The quiet genius, the man who built an empire by identifying patterns and anomalies, turned his formidable intellect inward upon his own life. He started noticing other things. The way Victoria guarded her phone, angling the screen away from him. The sudden increase in charity meetings that coincided perfectly with Adrian's new habit of working late from a remote office. He didn't confront her. Confrontation was for amateurs. It would lead to more lies, tearful denials, and a promise to do better, while the deceit would simply burrow deeper underground. Edward Langford did not deal in emotions, he dealt in data, and he needed data. His first move was quiet and clinical. He installed a sophisticated monitoring software on their home network, a custom program he'd written himself years ago for corporate security. It was undetectable, a ghost in the machine. He told himself it was for security to protect against external threats. But he knew he was looking for an internal one. He didn't have to wait long. Encrypted messages sent over third-party apps were harder to crack, but their digital footprints were still there. Metadata doesn't lie. The sheer volume of communication between Victoria's phone and Adrian's phone, often late at night when Edward was asleep beside her, was staggering. The frequency, the duration, it painted a stark, undeniable picture. The second step was to understand the financial why. Adrian was well paid, earning a high six-figure salary, but he was deeply in debt. A quick, discreet inquiry through a contact at a private credit analysis firm revealed a portfolio of failed investments, a taste for luxury cars, and a lifestyle that far outstripped his income. Adrian wasn't just ambitious, he was desperate. He wasn't in love with Victoria, he was in love with the Langford name and the billions attached to it. The confirmation of the physical affair came from the oldest method in the book, a private investigator. Edward hired a man named Michael Thornton, an ex-FBI agent with a reputation for absolute discretion and ruthless efficiency. He didn't want sordid pictures or dramatic confrontations. He wanted a timeline. Dates, times, locations. Thornton's first report landed on Edward's desk a week later in a plain manila envelope. Inside were photographs, not of them kissing or embracing, but of them entering and leaving the Clift Hotel in San Francisco separately, but with a telling interval of 10 minutes. Then the Rosewood in Menlo Park. Then a charming little inn in Carmel by the Sea. On a weekend, Victoria had claimed she was at a yoga retreat, and Adrian had taken a personal day. Edward stared at the glossy photos, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He saw his wife, her face alive with an excitement he hadn't seen directed at him in a decade. He saw his protégé, the young man he'd treated like a son, looking smug and triumphant. He felt a surge of white-hot rage, so intense it made him dizzy. He wanted to smash something, to scream, to confront them and watch them crumble. But then the CEO took over. The strategist, the man who had faced down hostile takeovers and corporate espionage. Raw emotion was a liability. A plan executed with precision and patience was power. He leaned back in his leather chair, the photos spread before him like battle plans, and the idea began to form. The retirement party. Victoria was already planning it, pouring all her energy into crafting this monument to his legacy. The irony was exquisite. She was building the very stage upon which her world would be dismantled. It was perfect. His next call was to his lawyer, David Chen. David was more than his attorney. He was his friend of 40 years, the one person who knew the real Edward Langford, the man behind the myth. They met not in a stuffy law office, but on a windswept bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean at Pebble Beach. Edward laid it all out. The suspicions, the software, the investigator, the photos. He spoke in a low, measured monotone, his face as impassive as the grey sea before them. David listened without interruption, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When Edward finished, he took a long, slow breath of the salt-laced air. "My God, Edward, I'm so sorry." "Don't be sorry, David. Be my lawyer," Edward said, his voice hard as flint. "I want to dissolve the marriage. I want to remove Adrian Locke from my company, and I want to do it in a way that they will never ever recover from. A quiet settlement would be cleaner," David advised, ever the pragmatist. "Less public, less messy." "Clean is what they're counting on," Edward countered. "They think I'm a fool who will quietly write a check to make the embarrassment go away. They've conspired to steal my life's work, my legacy. They've made a mockery of my home and my trust. There is nothing clean about that. This needs to be a public execution, a lesson in consequences." David studied his friend's face. He saw the deep, profound hurt behind the cold fury. This wasn't just about money or pride. It was about the desecration of something Edward held sacred loyalty. "All right, Edward," David said finally. "Your call. But if we're going to do this, we do it by the book. We need to be surgical. What about the prenup?" "The original one is standard," Edward said. "She'd still walk away with a fortune." "But," he paused, "do you remember the postnup we signed 10 years ago, after the Vantech acquisition, when my net worth quadrupled?" David's eyes lit up with recollection. "The one with the updated infidelity clause. The morality clause, as you called it. I told you it was aggressive. Is it ironclad? It was drafted by our best litigators. If you have unequivocal proof of adultery, leading to the dissolution of the marriage, it triggers the clause. She forfeits nearly all claims to assets acquired during the marriage. She gets her personal effects, a one-time lump sum for transition, and that's it. It's brutal, Edward." "Good," Edward said, a thin, chilling smile touching his lips for the first time. "That's the one." For the next several months, Edward and David worked in the shadows. They began the process of restructuring Edward's assets, moving key holdings into trusts that were protected from marital claims, all under the guise of estate planning for his retirement. They prepared a termination package for Adrian Locke that cited not only a breach of his employment contract's code of conduct, but also potential corporate espionage, given his access to sensitive information. They compiled a dossier, a thick, heavy binder filled with Thornton's reports, metadata logs, credit card statements from hotels. Victoria had paid for in cash and sworn affidavits. All the while, Edward played his part at home. He was the doting, if slightly distracted husband. He listened to Victoria's endless chatter about canapes and colour schemes for the party. He even had dinner with her and Adrian, once a torturous affair, where he had to watch them exchange subtle glances over the wine glasses he had paid for. He complimented Adrian on his work, on his dedication, all while picturing the moment he would personally have him escorted from the building. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. Every polite smile was a lie. Every moment of shared space, a betrayal he had to swallow down like bone. His only solace was the plan. The knowledge that a reckoning was coming. He was no longer just a husband or a CEO. He was an unseen observer, a ghost in his own life, counting down the days until he would finally spectacularly materialize. In the final 2 weeks leading up to the retirement gala, a palpable electricity filled the Langford villa. It was a current of pure, unadulterated hubris, generated primarily by Victoria and Adrian. They saw the finish line. Edward's upcoming retirement was the last hurdle before their imagined future could begin. Their caution, already thin, evaporated completely. They believed Edward was so consumed with the logistics of handing over his company and the sentimentality of his own legacy that he had become deaf-dumb and blind to the world around him. His quietness was misinterpreted as melancholy, his observant gazes as the unfocused stare of a man lost in memory. Victoria was incandescent. She swept through the house, a whirlwind of fabric swatches and seating charts. "Edward, darling, do you prefer the Dom Perignon 008 or the Krug or for the main toast?" she'd ask, holding up her phone with pictures of the bottles. "Whichever you think is best." "Leah," he'd answer from behind his newspaper, his voice placid. He knew from a receipt Thornton had recovered from the trash at a hotel that the Krug was what she and Adrian had shared on their last getaway. The choice was a tiny private joke she thought she was playing on him. Let her choose the vintage of her own execution. Adrian, for his part, had grown bold to the point of recklessness. He no longer confined his presence to helping Victoria. He started inserting himself into Edward's professional exit. He'd show up at Edward's home office, offering to help sort through old files or draft transition memos for the board. "Just want to make sure the legacy is protected, Edward." Adrian would say, his expression a mask of earnest sincerity. "I learned everything from you. I want to ensure the company you built is safe." Edward would nod slowly, looking Adrian dead in the eye. "I appreciate that, son. Loyalty is the most important thing. The only thing, really." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp, but Adrian, blinded by his own arrogance, didn't feel its edge. He heard only validation. Their secret conversations grew more audacious. They no longer used coded language. One afternoon, while Edward was supposedly at a final physical checkup, they sat by the Langfords' own pool, planning their future out loud. "The divorce will be messy, but he'll want it quiet," Victoria said, applying sun lotion to her legs. "He hates public scandal. We'll offer a quick settlement. I'll take the house in Aspen and the St. Bart's condo. You can leverage your position to take over as CEO once the dust settles. We'll be the new power couple." "He'll be devastated." "Of course," Adrian said, with a theatrical sigh. "But he's old. He'll move to his golf club in Florida, and we'll never hear from him again." He reached out and squeezed her hand. "It's for the best. We're doing him a favor, really. He deserves to rest." They were so certain of the script they had written. What they didn't know was that Edward's physical checkup had been rescheduled. He was in his second-floor study, the window slightly ajar, listening to every poisonous word. He wasn't angry anymore. The raw emotion had long since cooled and hardened into something far more dangerous: resolve. He stood there, a silent sentinel, as they plotted the carve-up of his life, and he felt a profound, almost peaceful certainty in the path he had chosen. Meanwhile, Edward's own plan was clicking into place with the quiet precision of a Swiss watch. The day before the party, he made 3 critical moves. First, he met with David Chen and signed the final divorce petition. It was a thick stack of papers, citing irreconcilable differences, but attached was the sealed dossier, the Exhibit A, containing the mountain of evidence of Victoria's adultery with Adrian Locke. The morality clause was highlighted and referenced no less than 7 times. A process server, a discreet man named Mr. Abernathy, was put on standby for the following evening. He was given a guest pass to the gala and a photo of Victoria. His instructions were simple: wait for the signal. Second, Edward called an emergency confidential meeting with 2 of the most trusted members of the Langford Innovations Board and the head of HR. In a secure conference room, He laid out a heavily redacted version of the situation. He didn't mention his wife. He simply stated that he had uncovered a severe breach of contract and ethics by a senior executive, Adrian Locke, involving exploitation of company resources and a profound conflict of interest. He presented evidence of Adrian using his corporate card for personal travel that matched his sick days and leveraging his position to gain personal favors. The board members were stunned. "We can fire him for cause," immediately one said. "No," Edward replied calmly. "His termination is effective tomorrow night at 9:30 p.m. I want security to be on standby at the gala. When I give the signal, I want him quietly but firmly escorted from the premises. His corporate accounts email and building access are to be terminated at that exact moment, not before." It was a show of ultimate power to dictate the very minute a man's career would end. Third, and most personally, he met with his daughter Chloe. He took her to the small, unassuming cafe where he used to take her for hot chocolate after school. The contrast with the opulence of their current life was intentional. "Chloe," he began, his voice softer than it had been in months, "there are things you are going to see and hear tomorrow night that will be very difficult to understand. It's going to be upsetting." Chloe's guard went up. "Dad, what's going on? You're scaring me. I can't explain it all right now. But I need to ask you for something. I need you to trust me. Not the CEO, not the millionaire. Me, your father. No matter what happens, no matter how it looks, I need you to know that every action I take is to protect our family's foundation and my life's work from people who wish to destroy it." He looked so tired, so burdened that Chloe's heart ached for him. She saw the man who had taught her to ride a bike and checked her homework, not the titan of industry. "Okay, Dad," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Okay, I trust you." His relief was a visible thing, a slight unclenching of his jaw, a softening in his eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart. That means more than you know." The evening of the gala arrived. The air in the villa was thick with the scent of Victoria's expensive perfume and the low thrum of anticipation. She was a vision in a shimmering, backless silver gown that had cost more than a car. She adjusted Edward's bow tie, her fingers cool against his skin. "You look handsome, darling," she purred. "Ready for your big night?" "More than ready," he said, looking at her reflection in the mirror. He saw the beautiful woman he had once loved, now a stranger, wearing his wife's face. Adrian arrived with the limousine, dressed in a custom tuxedo, looking every bit the heir apparent. He clapped Edward on the shoulder. "The end of an era, Edward. You should be proud." "Oh, I am, Edward," said his smile, never reaching his eyes. "I truly am." As they rode in silence to the Fairmont, the city lights sliding across the tinted windows, the three of them were trapped in a bubble of shared deception. But only Edward knew that in less than 3 hours that bubble wouldn't just pop, it would explode, showering everyone in the blast radius with the cold, hard truth. He felt a strange sense of calm. He was not the victim in this story anymore. He was the architect of its conclusion. The grand ballroom of the Fairmont was a breathtaking spectacle. Crystal chandeliers weighing thousands of pounds each dripped light onto a sea of 400 people who represented the pinnacle of San Francisco's high society tech world and old money families. The air hummed with conversation, the clinking of glasses, and the lush sounds of a string quartet playing softly in the corner. Victoria, on Edward's arm, was in her element, gliding through the crowd, accepting compliments on the perfection of it all. "Oh, it's all for Edward," she'd say with feigned humility. "He deserves nothing less." Edward played his part with stoic grace. He shook hands, accepted congratulations, and smiled his tired, benevolent smile. He watched Adrian work the room like a politician, schmoozing with board members, subtly positioning himself as the future of Langford Innovations. He saw his daughter Chloe circulating her expression, a mixture of pride and the lingering unease from their conversation the day before. He caught the eye of David Chen, who gave a barely perceptible nod from across the room. Everything was in place. Mr. Abernathy, the process server, stood inconspicuously near the bar, a bland-looking man in a grey suit, utterly invisible, yet holding the document that would ignite the inferno. After the exquisite five-course meal, the formal part of the evening began. The new CEO of Langford Innovations, a man Edward had handpicked to succeed him, gave a glowing tribute lauding Edward's genius and integrity. The mayor spoke of his philanthropic contributions to the city. One by one, people rose to praise the legend of Edward Langford. Through it all, Victoria sat at the head table, beaming like a queen. This was her triumph. She had orchestrated the perfect farewell for her husband, a flawless public display that masked the private coup she was about to enact. She glanced at Adrian, who was seated at a nearby table with other senior executives, and they shared a brief triumphant look. Their moment was coming. Finally, it was Edward's turn to speak. The room fell silent as he approached the lectern. The spotlight found him, bleaching the color from his face and highlighting the deep lines of fatigue around his eyes. He looked out at the expectant faces, the friends, the colleagues, the family. His gaze settled for a moment on Victoria, who gave him a radiant, encouraging smile. He began conventionally, his voice calm and steady. Thank you all for being here tonight. Looking out at this room, I see faces that have been with me for this entire journey. From a dusty garage in Palo Alto to this magnificent ballroom. We built something incredible together, something that will last. He spoke of the early days, the struggles, the victories. He thanked his team, his board, his partners. It was a perfect, gracious retirement speech. Victoria relaxed in her chair, a tear of what she imagined was pride glistening in her eye. Chloe felt a wave of relief wash over her. Perhaps her father's strange mood was just the emotion of the evening. Then Edward paused. He took a sip of water, and when he looked up again, the warmth was gone from his eyes. It was replaced by something cold and sharp, like fractured ice. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The air grew heavy. A legacy is not just about what you build, he continued, his voice taking on a harder edge. It's also about what you protect. It's about loyalty. It's about truth. And I've learned recently that these are commodities far rarer and more valuable than any stock option or algorithm. A confused murmur rippled through the audience. Victoria's smile faltered. She sat up straighter, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. This was not the speech they had rehearsed. I had planned to speak tonight about the future of Langford Innovations, Edward said, his gaze sweeping the room before locking directly onto Adrian Locke. But I find myself compelled to speak about a more personal business venture. A hostile takeover, if you will, one that has been meticulously planned behind my back. Adrian froze his wineglass halfway to his lips. His face went pale. The people at his table turned to look at him, their expressions bewildered. For the last 14 months, Edward's voice boomed, amplified by the speakers, while I have been planning my exit. 2 people in this room have been planning theirs. A future built on my life's work, predicated on the assumption that I was a blind, doddering old fool, ready to be put out to pasture. He turned his full attention to the head table, his eyes boring into his wife. Victoria's face had crumpled into a mask of disbelief and horror. She started to shake her head, a silent, desperate plea. My wife. Victoria, Edward, announced, his voice, devoid of all emotion, has been a very busy woman. Not just with planning this beautiful party, but with managing a very intimate partnership. A partnership with my own protégé. The man I treated like a son, Mr. Adrian Locke. Gasps erupted around the ballroom. The silence was shattered, replaced by a cacophony of shocked whispers. Phones began to emerge, their small red recording lights blinking on like malevolent eyes. Chloe stood up, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes darting between her mother's ashen face and Adrian's terrified one. I am not a man for theatrics, Edward lied coolly. I am a man for data. And the data is unequivocal. Receipts from hotels in Carmel and Sausalito, encrypted text messages detailing not just an affair, but a calculated plan to fleece me in a divorce. Timelines, locations, photographic evidence. He gestured towards Adrian's table. Adrian, your ambition has always been your greatest asset, but you aimed it at the wrong target. As of 9:30 p.m. tonight, which was 3 minutes ago, your employment at Langford Innovations has been terminated for gross misconduct and breach of your ethics contract. Your corporate accounts are frozen. Your access is revoked. 2 gentlemen from security are waiting for you by the exit. Please don't make a scene. Adrian looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. He sat paralyzed, his face a mottled canvas of red and white. The executives at his table physically recoiled from him, their chairs scraping on the floor. But Edward wasn't finished. He saved the finale for his wife. He turned back to Victoria, who was now openly weeping, her carefully constructed world imploding in real time. And Victoria, he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more terrifying than his shouting. You were right. I do hate public scandal, but I hate betrayal more. You wanted a grand spectacle to mark the end of my career, and you shall have one. He gave a small, almost imperceptible signal towards the bar. Mr. Abernathy, the process server, began to move. He walked calmly, purposefully, through the stunned crowd, weaving between tables of petrified guests. He walked directly to the head table and stopped behind Victoria's chair. You wanted a new chapter, Edward said, his voice resonating with a terrible finality. So let's begin it officially. Mr. Abernathy leaned forward and placed a thick, blue-backed legal document on the pristine white tablecloth directly in front of Victoria. The words, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage, were visible at the top. Victoria Langford. Edward's voice cut through her sobs. You have been served. The collective gasp in the room was like the sucking of all oxygen. Victoria stared at the papers as if they were a coiled snake. She looked up at Edward, her face a ruin of makeup and tears, her expression one of utter soul-shattering defeat. Edward looked out at the hundreds of shocked faces, the recording phones, the wreckage of his personal life laid bare. He felt no triumph, only the cold, hollow emptiness of a necessary amputation. He placed his speech notes neatly on the lectern, turned without another word, and walked off the stage. The silence he left behind was the most damning sound of all. The moment Edward Langford stepped off the stage, the ballroom erupted into controlled chaos. The stunned silence shattered, replaced by a rising crescendo of frantic whispers. The scraping of chairs and the unapologetic glare of dozens of phone cameras capturing Victoria's complete and utter humiliation. She remained frozen for a long moment, staring at the divorce papers. They felt impossibly heavy, an anchor, dragging her down into a cold, dark abyss. The silver gown that had felt so glamorous an hour ago now felt like a cage of shame. The whispers around her were like physical blows. Did you hear? Adrian Locke, of all people. The audacity. He knew the whole time. Her head snapped up, searching for Adrian. She saw him across the room, flanked by 2 large men in dark suits. They weren't touching him, but their presence was an invisible wall. Adrian's face was a mess of panic and fury. He tried to stand to say something, but one of the security men took a half step forward, a silent, unarguable command. Defeated, Adrian allowed himself to be guided towards a side exit, his walk of shame punctuated by the glares of his former colleagues. Their gazes met for a fleeting second, not with solidarity, but with mutual, venomous blame. Victoria's world had narrowed to the head table, the cruel legal document, and the pitying, contemptuous eyes of her friends. Her social circle, a constellation she had painstakingly cultivated, was now a firing squad. These were the women she had lunched with, the couples she had vacationed with. Now they looked at her as if she were a particularly fascinating and repulsive insect under a microscope. Chloe was the first to reach her. Her face was pale with shock, her mind reeling. "Mom," she whispered. Her voice choked. "Mum, what is this? Is it true?" Victoria couldn't answer. She could only sob a gut-wrenching, ugly sound that tore through the ballroom's hushed atmosphere. The performance was over. The Queen was dethroned. Grabbing the divorce papers, she stumbled from her chair and fled. Not with grace, but with the frantic desperation of a cornered animal, her silver train dragging on the floor behind her like a tattered flag of surrender. The party died instantly. Guests, sensing the spectacle was over, began to leave in droves, eager to be the first to spread the story. By midnight, the grand ballroom was nearly empty, the remnants of a lavish feast now looking like the scene of a disaster. The true fallout, however, began the next day. The legal and financial gears that Edward had so carefully set in motion began to grind. Victoria, holed up in a suite at the Four Seasons that she'd paid for with a dwindling personal credit card, finally met with her lawyer, a high-priced shark named Marcus Thorne. He read through the petition and the infamous postnuptial agreement. "This is bad, Victoria Thorne," said his usual bravado tempered. "This morality clause is an iron gate. Edward's team has attached Exhibit A. It's a dossier. We're talking financial records, private investigators' reports, server logs. He has a documented, time-stamped history of the affair. He can prove beyond any reasonable doubt that your adultery was the direct cause for the dissolution. He's not just alleging it, he's proving it with a mountain of evidence." "So what does that mean?" Victoria asked, her voice hoarse from crying. "It means the postnup is likely to be upheld. You forfeit your claim to nearly everything. The houses, the stock portfolios, the art collection. According to this, you're entitled to your personal belongings, the jewelry he gifted you before the postnup was signed, and a one-time payment of $500,000. Victoria stared at him blankly. $500,000. To anyone else it was a fortune. To her it was an insult. It was less than her decorating budget for the Aspen house. That's it. After 20 years of marriage, 20 years, yes, but the clause specifies assets acquired during the marriage, which is almost everything. You came into the marriage with very little, and this clause essentially reverts you to that state plus the settlement. It's designed to be punitive, and Edward has the proof to make it stick. Her hope for a quiet multi-million-dollar settlement evaporated. She wasn't a wronged wife. She was a disgraced adulterer legally and publicly. She tried calling Adrian, but his number went straight to a disconnected message. His corporate phone was dead, and he had already been scrubbed from the company website. He was a ghost. Adrian, meanwhile, was experiencing his own personal hell. He was a pariah. The news of his public firing and the reason for it had spread through Silicon Valley like a virus. He received a formal termination letter via courier that not only confirmed his firing for cause, but also included a veiled threat of legal action for corporate espionage, ensuring he would never work in a position of trust in the industry again. His professional network, once his greatest asset, evaporated overnight. Calls went unreturned. Invitations were rescinded. He was blacklisted. He finally managed to get a message to Victoria a week later through a mutual acquaintance. They met in a sterile coffee shop in a town neither of them frequented. The glamour was gone. They were just two desperate, defeated people. "You have to help me," Adrian pleaded, his charisma replaced by a whining desperation. "My career is over. I'm ruined. You have to give me some of the settlement money." Victoria laughed, a bitter, humorless sound. "What settlement? He's taking everything. Adrian, I'm walking away with crumbs because of you and your recklessness. Because of me," he shot back, his voice rising. "You were the one who was so sure he was clueless. You were the one planning to take him for half." The argument spiraled, their partnership of greed dissolving into a cesspool of blame and recrimination. They saw each other clearly for the first time, not as lovers or partners, but as co-conspirators in a failed plot, each looking for someone else to blame for their own ruin. Their dream of Monaco was dead, replaced by the grim reality of court dates and social ostracism. The most profound fallout, however, was within the Langford family itself. Chloe was devastated. She avoided her father for days, sickened by the public nature of the humiliation. She loved her mother, and seeing her broken like that was agonizing. Edward gave her space. Finally, she came to his study, her eyes red and accusing. "Why, Dad?" she demanded, her voice shaking with emotion. "Why did you have to do it like that, in front of everyone? You destroyed her. You destroyed us." Edward didn't offer excuses. He simply gestured to a locked drawer in his desk. He opened it and pulled out the dossier, the real one, not the redacted version. He laid it on the desk between them. "I didn't want you to ever see this, Chloe, but you need to understand, this wasn't just about an affair." He opened the binder. He showed her everything. The transcripts of the texts weren't just romantic, they were strategic. Once the old man is out of the picture, make sure you get power of attorney. We can liquidate the R&D fund. He showed her Adrian's credit report, the mountains of debt. He played her a short, muffled audio recording from the day by the pool, captured by a long-range microphone he had instructed Thornton to use. He made her listen to her own mother and the man she called Uncle Adrian, plotting to dismantle her father's legacy and cast him aside. Chloe read and listened, her anger slowly being replaced by a sickening cold horror. This was so much uglier than she had imagined. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a premeditated crime of greed. The public humiliation wasn't just an act of revenge. It was a defensive strike. It was Edward protecting his life's work, his very identity, from predators he had welcomed into his own home. She looked up at her father, seeing him clearly for the first time in months. The cold strategist was gone. In his place was a man who looked profoundly lonely and wounded. The public execution of his marriage was also a public admission of his own pain, his own failure to see the truth until it was almost too late. He had to know he could never get away with it, Chloe said, her voice barely a whisper. "You built that company. It's a fortress." He knew, Edward said quietly. "But Adrian didn't. Your mother didn't. They saw the fortress and they wanted the keys. My mistake was giving them a map." Chloe closed the binder, her hands trembling. The last vestiges of her anger toward her father dissolved, replaced by a deep, aching sadness for him, for their broken family, for the years they had all lived a lie. She walked around the desk, and for the first time since she was a little girl, she put her arms around her father's shoulders and held him. The fallout was devastating, but in the wreckage, a foundation, however, cracked remained between father and daughter. And for Edward, that was the only part of his legacy that truly mattered anymore. 6 months after the gala that sent shockwaves through San Francisco's elite, the dust had settled, revealing a landscape irrevocably altered. The story of Edward Langford's revenge had become a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties and business lunches about the dangers of underestimating a quiet man. For Victoria, the fallout was a slow, grinding descent into a life she no longer recognized. The court proceedings were swift and brutal. The evidence Edward presented was so overwhelming that her lawyer advised her not to fight it. The post-nuptial agreement was upheld. She received her one-time payment of $500,000, a sum that was quickly devoured by legal fees, taxes, and the sudden shocking cost of maintaining a semblance of her former life without a billionaire's backing. She sold the pre-postnup jewelry, the Chanel bags, the furs. It was a temporary reprieve. She moved from the Four Seasons to a luxury apartment, then to a respectable but generic condominium in a less fashionable part of the city. Her friends had long since abandoned her. Their invitations stopped. Their calls went unanswered. To them, she was no longer an asset. She was a liability, a symbol of scandal. Her relationship with Adrian had imploded spectacularly after their coffee shop argument. They saw each other one last time in a lawyer's office, where he attempted to sue her for half of her meager settlement, claiming he was a partner in their joint venture. The case was laughed out of court, but the act cemented their mutual hatred. Victoria was left utterly alone, haunted by the ghost of a life she had thrown away. She was no longer Mrs. Langford. She was just Victoria, a woman in her late 40s, with a tarnished name, expensive tastes she could no longer afford, and a future that was a vast, terrifying blank. The bitterness was a constant taste in her mouth. The regret, a weight that settled deep in her bones, a permanent chill that no designer coat could warm. Adrian Locke's fate was in many ways worse. He had been professionally excommunicated, blacklisted in the tech world, his name synonymous with treachery. He couldn't find a job. He sold his Porsche, defaulted on his loans, and was forced to move back in with his bewildered parents in Ohio. The charismatic, ambitious executive was gone, replaced by a sullen, resentful man who spent his days railing against the injustice of it all, refusing to accept his own role in his downfall. He had gambled everything on a single, arrogant bet and had lost in the most public way imaginable. His regret wasn't for the betrayal, but for getting caught. In the quiet hills of Atherton, life for Edward and Chloe Langford found a new rhythm. The sprawling villa, once a stage for grand deceptions, became a sanctuary. Edward, freed from the burdens of his company and his toxic marriage, seemed to shed years. The cold, calculating strategist who had delivered that fateful speech receded, and the father Chloe remembered began to re-emerge. They took long walks. They had simple dinners on the patio, talking for hours. He taught her the intricacies of the stock market, not as a tool for wealth, but as a study in human psychology. She, in turn, reintroduced him to the world of art, taking him to small independent galleries and explaining the passion behind the brushstrokes. One evening, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Chloe asked the question that still lingered in her mind. "Dad, do you ever regret it? Doing it so publicly?" Edward was silent for a long time, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon. "I regret that it was necessary," he said finally. "I regret the pain it caused you. I don't regret the act itself. It wasn't for the guests. It wasn't for the gossip columns. It was for me. I needed to reclaim my own story. They tried to write an ending for me, the sad, oblivious old man. I couldn't let that be the final chapter." He turned to her, his eyes clear and direct. "And it was for Adrian, and for anyone else who might look at what I built and see only a prize to be taken. I needed to send a message that my legacy, our legacy, has teeth. Integrity isn't passive. Sometimes you have to fight for it." In the following months, Edward discovered a new purpose. He poured his energy and a significant portion of his fortune into a foundation dedicated to funding young, overlooked entrepreneurs, the kind of hungry, brilliant kid he once was. He didn't just write checks. He mentored them, using his decades of experience to guide them, instilling in them the values of hard work and, above all, loyalty. Chloe became the foundation's director, her eye for art, translating into an uncanny ability to spot creativity and potential in people. They became a team, their bond forged anew in the ashes of their old family. The story of Edward Langford didn't end with a bang, but with a quiet, powerful hum of renewal. He had faced the ultimate betrayal and had not been destroyed by it. He had taken control surgically, removed the cancer from his life, and had begun the slow, painful process of healing. He had lost a wife, but he had regained his daughter, and in doing so, had found a peace that all his billions could never buy. The gilded cage was gone. Its bars melted down. In its place stood a man free and whole, ready to build something new, something that would truly last. The others were left with nothing but regrets, a bitter aftertaste of a feast they had tried to steal from the wrong table. In the end, this wasn't just a story of revenge. It was a brutal lesson in consequences. Edward Langford, chose to turn a moment of profound personal pain into a public display of strength, not just to punish, but to protect his life's work and reclaim his own narrative. Victoria and Adrian, blinded by greed and arrogance, learned that the empires people build are often protected by foundations much deeper and stronger than they appear. Their story serves as a stark reminder that betrayal carries a price, and sometimes that price is everything. What do you think? Was Edward's public takedown justified, or did he go too far? Could there have been a different path? We all face betrayal in our lives, big and small, and the choices we make in those moments define us. Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a story of justice, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable real-life dramas.